Hi, everyone, and thank you for joining us this afternoon. My name is Joanna Quinn. I'm the director of the Center for Transitional Justice and Post-Conflict Reconstruction here at Western University. Today's panel on the Russian invasion of Ukraine is co-sponsored by both the TJ Center and by the Public and Private International Law Research Group at Western Law. As is our custom, I would like to acknowledge that Western University is located on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, Lenape-Wauk, and Chonocton peoples. The Huron-Wendat peoples also have a history of living in this territory. And this land continues to be home to diverse Indigenous peoples, First Nations, Métis, and Inuit. By recognizing First Nations peoples' relationships to the land, we make explicit the presence of Indigenous peoples and their rights to self-determination. I've been thinking a lot lately about how questions of invasion and occupation, like Russian actions in Ukraine and the excruciating costs for the people who've been living there, bear remarkable similarities to the experiences of Indigenous peoples. To echo the words of the Kenyan ambassador to the UN Security Council at the beginning of the Russian aggression in Ukraine, questions of invasion and the imposition of one state's will on another is an old story. And it is unequivocal that the invasion of Ukraine and the use of force by one country against another is a clear violation of international law. Today marks exactly 1 month since Russia invaded Ukraine. That's 28 long days and nights. And instead of becoming clearer, much of what is taking place seems to be getting muddier. And so we've again assembled an expert panel to help us understand what's taking place and to help us understand the structures of international law and order. Our 3 speakers are all researchers affiliated with the Center for Transitional Justice and Post-Conflict Reconstruction here at Western. In alphabetical order, let me introduce them to you now. Marta Ditchok is a professor of history and political science. She's also a fellow at the University of Toronto's Munk School of Global Affairs and adjunct professor at the National University of the Kyiv-Molia Academy. She specializes in the politics and history of Ukraine and Russia and Eastern Europe with a focus on post-communism, mass media, and migration. Kate Koritsky is a professor of gender, sexuality, and women's studies and a comparative political sociologist. Her research looks at imagined group and national identities in the creation of powerful and often oblivious majorities. Her forthcoming book explores how collective remembering of communism is implicated in the formation of modern anti-Semitism in Poland. Valerie Oosterveld is a professor of law and the associate director of the TJ Center. Her research and writing focus on gender issues within international criminal justice. Before joining the Faculty of Law, Professor Oosterveld served in the Legal Affairs Bureau of what was then called the Department of Foreign Affairs and International Trade, where she provided legal advice on international criminal accountability for genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes. Now, throughout today's session, I hope you'll feel free to send me your questions using the chat, and we'll try to answer as many as we can. We've gathered some questions ahead of time, and I'm going to jump right in to start with Professor Marta Ditchok. Marta, you've been working day and night for the last 28 days, longer. Where are you at? What's the situation? What are the issues that have captured your attention?
Thank you, Professor Quinn, for once again organizing this important event. As you noted, this is a month since this horrible war began. Today is a big, important day on the international scene, and I think my co-panelists will address that. There are meetings of NATO, the EU, and G7 happening. I think as we speak, I think some of them are finished. What I would like to start with is a photograph. If I can share my screen. This is a little boy who I call Little V. This is Max's son. He turned 2 days ago. Max posted this photograph saying, "Really sorry I can't be with you on your birthday because I have to be somewhere else." And as you remember, Max is now serving in the Territorial Defense Unit defending Kyiv from the war that has been ongoing for an entire month and the city of Kyiv is under severe attack as we speak. Last time I spoke at this panel, I started with Max, and Max shortly became a media star. He started getting all sorts of requests from media to speak about what's going on and his personal experiences. And he was doing that. And then after a while, I'm in touch with him and he said, Marta, I just can't keep doing this because a lot of the journalists who are contacting me are very unprepared. And the questions they're asking me are very uninformed. And that is exactly my experience as well, which is one of the reasons I have stopped taking those media calls. Journalists in Ukraine and commentators have faced this throughout the conflict, and it is in part the information war that Putin is perpetrating against Ukraine. And yesterday, Ukrainian media professionals, can you see that? I'm doing my screen share.
Marta, we can't, we're still seeing happy little people.
Okay, well, this is what I want to do is screen share this. The open letter, can you see it now? Okay, thank you. This is an open letter that was issued yesterday from media professionals in Ukraine to media professionals in the world. And what they're saying is precisely what I've been experiencing. You need to use the correct terminology. The number of times journalists are still using the phrase Ukraine crisis, Ukraine conflict, whereas in fact, it is Russia's war in Ukraine, Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Another that they are appealing journalists to be aware of is not to call it Putin's war, because it's not Putin who was bombing the maternity hospital in Mariupol. It's not Putin who arrested and kidnapped the democratically elected mayor of Melitopol. It's not Putin who is singing in churches. And I just want to show you something that's quite chilling, and I hope I get this one correct. This is, I don't know if you're going to hear the sound. This is a men's choir in St. Petersburg, and what they're singing is, we are going to get in our nuclear submarines and load our bombs and cross the Atlantic. There are students of Russia's top university, the Institute of International Relations, who are making statements that are supporting Russian propaganda, saying, we are students, you nationalists, put down your arms, we are all one people, Ukrainians and Russians. The reason I'm showing you all of this is to reiterate the point that it is not just Putin who is perpetrating this war. And we really need to keep that in mind. A new narrative that is coming out of the Kremlin is to, again, I'm not sure, can you see this screen? This is Anton Shehotsov. He is a scholar, a Russian scholar, who is making the point that a new narrative is to draw attention to the suffering of ordinary Russians and compare it to the invasion of Ukraine. And this is just a recent manipulation to be aware of. Journalists are the enemy in this war because they're the ones that are exposing what happened. And some of you may have come across this report, but those of you who haven't, the images, the video, and the photographs we saw of the bombing of the maternity hospital in Mariupol were done by this team of journalists. 2 AP journalists were in there, and they became targets of the Russian forces. They, in this article, which I can put the link to in the chat, they describe how they went in there and how they filmed the bombing of the hospital and how Russian soldiers were hunting for them so that that footage couldn't get out, how Ukrainian soldiers and doctors were helping them to upload the video because you have to be outside to catch the signal in a city under siege. So Ukrainian soldiers were covering them while they were uploading that video that made it because the Russian narrative is these fascist Ukrainians are destroying their own city. And it's brave journalists like Mstislav who are showing us what is actually happening. We are not seeing video of Mariupol anymore because these two last foreign journalists were evacuated out by the Ukrainian forces through a humanitarian corridor because they were being hunted down by the Russian forces. And journalists have been targeted throughout this conflict. And the Institute of Mass Information in Kyiv issued a report today detailing the attacks against journalists and media in 1 month. Then they calculated 148 crimes since the 24th of February. 5 journalists are killed, 6 are captured, 7 wounded, 19 cyber attacks, 11 death threats, 10 TV towers shelled, incidents with shooting with journalists, switching off Ukrainian broadcasts, digital blockades, editorial offices seized, journalists missing. So this is the attack that is happening against journalists, against information coming out of Ukraine. I don't want to end on a negative note, so I would like to share some positive news. The last time we had this TJ seminar organized by Dr. Quinn and Oosterholt, I raised the issue of how we as academics can help displaced Ukrainians. And yesterday, the announcement came out, our university has set up 10 positions for Ukrainian students to come and study at our university. Professor Jared Seitz is the one who is the motor behind this, and it's the Ivy Business School that has put forward the money. And as soon as they can get here, 10 students will be receiving an MBA on an exchange basis. So that is excellent news. And Lise Laporte was instrumental in doing this. 10 spots is great. And I think we're actually the first university to put something in place because there's a lot of people working on these types of agreements. We have created 10 spots. There are 2.5 million people displaced. So we need to do more. There will be an announcement coming from the Tri-Council shortly and Universities Canada. So I encourage everybody in the audience, talk to your deans, talk to your anybody to create more positions for more students and scholars to be able to come. I'd also like to give a shout out to the Ukrainian Students Association on campus, which have been doing a fabulous job organizing all sorts of activities. So please reach out to them if you're inclined to get involved. And just to end on an even happier note, there's my favorite, well, not my favorite, one of my favorite Ukrainian punk bands. They're called Beton, which means concrete. They released a song with the blessing of Clash, and it's called Kyiv Calling. I don't know if you can see that, if you can hear it, but it's an excellent.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ditchuk. There's volume issues, but it's a song I've heard too. And let me just add on to the at-risk scholar question. There's a lot happening behind the scenes, so I think we can expect more announcements in the days to come, and it's in thanks in part to Professor Ditchuk. Let me ask both Professor Koritsky, I'll ask Kate first, and Dr. Ditchuk about the relationship between Ukraine and its neighbors in the region. And specifically, I've been thinking about migration concerns and mutual aid concerns and how that impacts the relationship. Dr. Koritsky, to you first.
Thank you, Dr. Quinn. Thank you, Joe. As have been mentioned by everybody by now, we're in day 28 of the invasion, which occurred on many fronts on the eastern side of Ukraine on February 24th. And this multi-pronged invasion encountered remarkable resistance, which seems to have surprised the invading forces. Why they were surprised offers an interesting glimpse into the Russian narration of Ukrainian self-understanding, national self-understanding. But the surprise led to a shift from the brutality of the conventional war to a barbarity of targeting civilians, their homes, cities, villages, and infrastructure, targeting so that life becomes unbearable or barely bearable, and return and rebuilding becomes harder, laborious, and painful. So the targeting of people and their homes and towns resulted in mass displacement of population within the Ukraine, where those who could leave to eastern part made their way to the western part, and International Rescue Committee's latest numbers, and they're always estimates, they think it's close to 6.5 million people are internally displaced in Ukraine, and that's in 28 days. Additionally, by now, 3.5 million people crossed borders to Moldova, Hungary, and Poland, the vast majority of them to Poland. There are, of course, many who remain in occupied cities and cities which are on the front line and under active attacks. So I am going to concentrate on Poland because I know that story the best, and the Polish welcome of refugees has been remarkable thus far, made more so for being very much a bottom-up initiative. So on the one hand, the state did open its borders and allowed the escaping refugees to enter. This is important to note because the very same government didn't open the borders, on the contrary, to fleeing Afghani refugees trapped in the no man's land of Belarus in just a few months ago. So it did open the borders now. This is very good. Further, the government made public transport free from Ukrainian people so they could move away from the borders and further into the country, and is allowing Ukrainian refugees right to work. This is across the board in the EU, as well as access to education and health. And after doing this, the government hesitated as to what to do next, if anything. So into the gap, into that hesitation, stopped local administrators, the NGO sector, as well as well-organized individuals, many of whom are Ukrainian by origin, because there's between 1 and 2 million people from Ukraine in Poland there were before the war. Who have taken on the provision of shelter, food, transportation, etc. The state is considering now paying compensation to families who are hosting refugees, and all believe it would have been by far better if they paid refugees directly. And this is not undoable, since all can have bank accounts that can be flagged as refugees, so they can receive assistance. It is clear that the welcome, as remarkable as it is, needs to develop its infrastructure so that escaping Ukrainian people can be supported in dignity in some period of time. So this can only be done for so long by local governments, NGOs, and people on the ground. And the need for it is becoming obviously urgent, because there are already networks of traffickers appearing at the borders. And if you can't tell people who want to assist people are those who want to kidnap them, then you're entering an issue of a dangerous territory. So this clearly means the EU will need to step up with some form of assistance, but how this is going to look is uncertain. On the one hand, EU and its governing institutions are not fast. Leaders have met to discuss the relief package to Ukraine now in week 4, which is quite slightly delayed. And they're still talking of what that relief package might look like. This is remarkable because the supply chain of food in Ukraine are collapsing, and the signs of this have been clear for a while now. And even though Ukraine understandably halted all of its large exports of barley and wheat, this may mean locally produced food is not reaching people who actually need to get it. So just as an aside, in drawing a larger world community into this circle and affected party, the United Nations by now warning that Russia's invasion of Ukraine could lead to a, quote, hurricane of hunger and meltdown of global food system. Wheat and fertilizer prices have soared since the war began, and the UN Food and Agriculture Organization warns that global food prices could jump 22% this year. This will have a devastating effect, I'm continuing to quote the UN, on the global south. So this is just an example of how a war in one part of the globe has ripple effects globally. So to return to Poland, Hungary, and the EU, And to conclude, the state assistance with refugee settlement is complicated by the fact that the governments in Poland and Hungary, the PiS and Fidesz parties, shape their political stance in opposition to the EU. They have had many a run-in with the EU over the different facets of their authoritarian policies, and they themselves narrate the EU as an imperial force which they want to repel in the name of the parochial and nationalist interest. So, but they will need the EU, and they will therefore need to find a way of accepting that help without appearing to do so. So this will not be an easy collaboration, hopefully with little effect on the refugees. So I'll leave it at that, and we can pick up Justin Trudeau and Canada if there is interest further on.
Thank you very much, Professor Koritsky. One of the things that we've been thinking a lot about in the center is the sort of double standard and complex solidarities. And we've got plans in place for another event. We'll send out details, but thinking about what it means to stand in solidarity with Ukrainians, and also to continue to stand in solidarity with Afghans and others, Rohingya, others who have been in dire straits for a long time. Professor Oosterveld, I'm coming to you next. The question raised is this: taking into consideration Canada's obligations under international law, how is Canada responding to the Russian invasion of Ukraine?
Thank you very much, Dr. Quinn. I am going to outline 4 recent ways that Canada has raised the issue of international law and its response to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, including through the lens of feminist foreign policy. So the first and most obvious one, because it received the most press, is that the International Criminal Court's prosecutor announced on February the 28th that he was planning to launch an investigation into war crimes and crimes against humanity in the Ukraine, which was building on his office's previous examination of the Ukrainian situation dating back to 2013, 2014. However, because Ukraine is not a party, has not joined the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, the prosecutor would have needed to wait for the judges to give approval to this investigation. And in response, Canada, as a state party to the Rome Statute, was one of 41 countries that referred the situation in the Ukraine to the International Criminal Court's prosecutor back on March the 2nd. And what this did was allow the prosecutor to skip the procedural hurdle of waiting for the judge's approval. And he did immediately launch into his investigation. So for example, he was in Ukraine last week on March the 16th, and already has investigators on the ground there looking into numerous reports of war crimes and crimes against humanity. In fact, there are reports of war crimes and crimes against humanity emerging multiple times every single day in this conflict. Canada is continuing to support the International Criminal Court in its work in Ukraine, and is, my understanding, is currently considering what kind of additional assistance it can provide. The second example that I wanted to give is that on March the 7th, Canada, in partnership with 44 other countries, initiated the Moscow mechanism through the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, or OSCE. And what that mechanism is, it was created in 1991, is to establish a fact-finding mission of experts. So this particular fact-finding mission, which has just been put in place, is to address the human rights and humanitarian impacts of Russia's invasion, Belarus's support, and acts of war against the people of Ukraine. Third, yesterday, Russia put forward a resolution to the United Nations Security Council on the humanitarian situation in Ukraine, and this resolution did not mention its own responsibility for the very serious humanitarian situation in Ukraine. It was not adopted in the UN Security Council. And this morning, Canada and others were successful in having a resolution on the humanitarian situation in Ukraine adopted by 140 states in favor, 5 against, and 38 countries abstaining. And that resolution did recognize Russian responsibility for the dire humanitarian situation in the Ukraine. And this is the second UN General Resolution supported by Canada in recent weeks and championed by Canada in recent weeks, the first one having been adopted back in early March. Now, the UN General Assembly also had a resolution put forward to it, and it voted not to take any action on this South African resolution, which was on the humanitarian situation in Ukraine, but did not name Russia and seemed to be put forward on Russia's behalf. So that was not acted upon, whereas the other one naming Russia was acted upon today. The last example I wanted to give is that Canada is deeply engaged at the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, the OPCW. And the OPCW is very important because it's monitoring the status of the nuclear reactors in Russia, as well as mentions by Russia with respect to chemical weapons. So the OPCW has been meeting, and Canada has been taking a very public stand against Russia's disinformation about Ukraine having a chemical weapons program, and expressing concern that these statements seem to be signaling, unfortunately, that Russia may be intending to use chemical or biological weapons in Ukraine and blame it on Ukraine. So that's called a false flag claim. The use of chemical weapons would, of course, be a violation of the Chemical Weapons Convention. And Canada's been pointing out that Russia has used chemical weapons in the past. And in fact, the OPCW is still investigating the use by Russia of chemical weapons against political opponents, including Alexei Navalny. And there's evidence from other sources of Russia's use of chemical weapons in Syria. So these concerns are very real. And I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Professor Oosterveld. Professor Ditchok, here's another question for you as a historian, someone who's spent a lot of time thinking about relations not only in the region, but specifically between Russia and Ukraine. How have you heard with your conversations with colleagues and so on, how do Ukrainians understand what's happening?
Well, that's a big question. Ukrainians are very well informed. They are on the receiving end of this war. But the historical dimension here is really important because part of the information war, I've been talking about what's happening right now, but Putin is framing all of this in historical terms. And he's constructed a completely false narrative that is being peddled as justification for denazification and demilitarization of Ukraine, because Ukrainians are really Russians. They're not a separate people, according to Putin. And his essay that was published last summer, that I don't think he actually wrote, but he just gave some historian, here's the key points that you put in this article, basically said, Ukraine doesn't exist as a nation. We're all Russians, you're little Russians, and the Belarusians, they're white Russians. And the historical narrative, that's what's actually being taught in a lot of Russian history courses throughout Russia, and sadly throughout lots of North American universities as well. This perception that this is all one big nation with 3 branches. And that's why we have these students from a top university in Russia peddling the same myth, because that's what they're being taught. Now, if you actually look at the history, all of the points that he's making, that Crimea has always been Russia, well, that's actually completely false. Crimea became part of Russia as a result of imperial expansion in 1783. And before that, it was the Crimean Khanate and the ancestral homeland of the Crimean Tatars. That isn't being taught, and that is being sort of glossed over. And so the use of historical myths to justify what's happening is a huge part of what is going on. And this is why there are so many panels now about the uses and abuses of history and how that needs to be sort of clarified. And I have a feeling that enrollment in Ukrainian history courses is going to go up as a result of all of this, because there are a lot of historians who are teaching it and there are publications. But I mean, Russia has been trying to suppress that narrative because their history was written after imperial expansion into Ukraine, and they took over the name Rus because that's Kievan Rus. So Muscovy renames itself Russia, takes over the history, and constructs this narrative that, you know, we started in Kyiv, which is actually the capital of modern day Ukraine, not Moscow. But there is a historian, Karamzin, who wrote a 12-volume history of the Russian state, and that's still the basis of the historical narrative that's used today. A Ukrainian historian, Mikhailo Grushevsky, wrote a 10-volume history of Kievan Rus, where he challenges that narrative and says that is a statist imperialist narrative. Here's social history. Here's what actually happened. Now, his work was suppressed by the Soviets, and he died under mysterious circumstances. So his work has not been very well known internationally. But the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies has embarked on this long 20-year project, translated his work, and each volume is this thick. I just got the last one, so I can't say that I've read all of it myself because it's a lot of reading, but I have ordered it for Weldon Library for anybody who wants to take a look. And he uses sources in many different languages, so Ottoman sources and Austrian sources. And that's really where we need to focus, is to actually go back and learn the history. And then you can dispel all of these distortions that are happening. Because as long as people sort of continue believing that Russians and Ukrainians are the same people, that's so absurd in Ukrainians. And this is the other point that in the open letter, the Ukrainian journalists say, include our voices. So don't talk about us, talk with us, and invite us to your seminars and invite us to all of your events, because we can explain to you what is happening. So all of these talking heads who probably don't even know where Mariupol is are commenting on what's going on in Ukraine. People in Ukraine aren't being asked often enough to speak for themselves. So that's another appeal to everybody, is let's include their voices, because they can tell us what's going on. They know, they're living it.
Dr. Duchuk, can I just ask a follow-up? Because your explanation of Russian history versus other histories makes me wonder what the overlay then of the media question that you addressed earlier is. So if there are whole groups of people who have been taught X and Y, and the current media that's coming out is also reaching, you know, Eastern Ukraine is receiving different media reports from Russian outlets and so on. Are there schisms within the Ukrainian population that we might not be aware of here? Or how does that affect how Ukrainians themselves are internally coherent?
That's an excellent question, because one of Putin's themes is that he needs to go into Ukraine to protect Russians and Russian speakers because they're all pro-Russian and pro-Putin. No society is monolithic. In Ukrainian public opinion, same as Canadian and American public opinion, is divided. And there have always been people who are pro-Russian in Ukraine. And there are still people like that today. If you look at public opinion polls, or let's start with 1991, 90% of the population votes for independence from the Soviet Union. So that's like the first marker. If you look at the last public opinion poll in Donetsk and Luhansk before 2014, about 20 to 30% of the population had pro-Russian views. If you look at the last election in Crimea, democratic election before it was annexed, Ukraine's an imperfect but democracy. So there were, right now, the situation's changed, but there were pro-Russian parties, and they ran for office, and they got something like 3% of the vote in the last election. So yes, there are pro-Russians in Ukraine, but once Ukraine became independent, they started publishing history books that were based on Mikhailo Hrushevsky's narrative. So for 30 years, people have been studying that. Everybody who learned their history before, they still have the old narratives. And that's what the book that I'm supposed to be writing about during my sabbatical is, history and memory and how it's taught. And hopefully I will get to that at some point, but I hope that sort of addresses your question.
Thank you
And
very
sort
much.
of the unintended result of Putin attacking Ukraine is he has consolidated Ukrainian identity in a way that 30 years of statehood was working towards. And if you watch a lot of the videos that are coming out of the southern parts where Russian forces have been successful, where they've taken over cities like Melitopol, which is heavily Russified, you have Ukrainians coming out with their blue and yellow flags in Russian, yelling at the Russian troops. So they're using the Russian language because that's the language they speak, but they're yelling, "Go home, invaders, go home, orcs," because that's what they call them. The meme is these Russian invaders are called orcs from, Lord of the Rings. These monsters come to kill us. But they're yelling at them in Russian. So this language and identity issue he hasn't divided Ukraine, he's consolidated it in a way that we haven't really seen to this degree before.
Thank you very much. Next question, Professor Oosterveld. Recently, there was an International Court of Justice decision. What was the decision, and what does that decision signal to the international community?
Thank you. The decision came out last week on March the 16th, and it was something called provisional measures. So it's like the first step in the case that Ukraine brought against Russia before the International Court of Justice, where the court is able, if it chooses to issue something like an injunction, what we would call an injunction here in Canada. And by 13 votes to 2, which is a high degree of unanimity within the court. The court is often much more divided than that. 13 votes to 2 ordered Russia to immediately suspend its military operations in Ukraine, and also by 13 votes to 2 ordered Russia to withdraw military individuals who are not directly under the Russian military. So for example, Belarusian soldiers or Russian-backed militia in Donbass. The way in which the preliminary measures were worded was very, very strong, very, very clear. The court was sending a very strong message to Russia that it does not countenance its arguments at this point in time. That, of course, raises the question that I've been asked many times since, is President Putin and the Russian military are not going to listen to the International Court of Justice. They have not followed international law to date, whether it's in Georgia or Chechnya or in Syria or in Ukraine. What good is this? And I would argue that there is some good, and the good is that it's another lever of pressure by Ukraine on Russia. It's a peaceful lever of pressure, but every lever, as I mentioned in our last transitional justice session on Ukraine, Ukraine has asked that every lever be pulled in the international legal community. But it also provides these provisional measures provide legal support for other actions within the United Nations system and the International Criminal Court and the European Union. So for example, today, when the UN General Assembly adopted its resolution condemning Russia's aggression, Russia's invasion of the Ukraine and the humanitarian situation that's resulted, there were many references to the ICJ's ruling. So it can be helpful in that respect. Also, very pragmatically, by creating this lever, Ukraine can use it in its peace negotiations with Russia, forced peace negotiations, I should say, with Russia.
So then, Professor Oosterveld, what I understand you to say is that there are symbolic dimensions of that decision that extend far beyond the decision itself.
Yes, exactly. And I would, I don't know that I would call it necessarily simply symbolic, in that it provides legal backing to, for example, the humanitarian response.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. Professor Koritsky, here's a question for you. Sanctions. There was a lot made of sanctions a month ago, 2 weeks ago. The question received is, how is Russia not bankrupt? Are the sanctions not working? If they're working, why is there still a war? What can you tell us?
Thanks for this juicy question. So I'm going to start making a very provocative statement and hopefully be able to defend it, as that Russia has already lost the war. I don't mean on moral grounds, because it never had any, but it lost the war because it will emerge out of it much weakened and much weaker than it hoped to be at the end. The question, of course, is how to end it, but that's maybe separate. So what I'm saying is counterintuitive, in that the most seriously taken under consideration objective of the invasion was to ensure a security perimeter around the Russia border. That is, Russia started the war in order to forestall or deter what it perceived as NATO expansion. So if Ukraine agrees not to seek NATO membership, as President Zelensky signaled in the last few days, and if Ukraine becomes a neutral state, if this is possible for the Ukrainian people to accept, then it would seem that Russia won the objective. And this may be the case, but in the process of pushing for this objective, and that's kind of my contention, Russia has been subject to truly crippling sanctions and a tectonic shift in German energy and military policy. So Putin will have really a hard time undoing the effects of the war, or arguing them away from among the Russian electorates. And I would say that he outplayed his hand. So let me unpack this. Russia is used to sanctions, but it's used to them being very milquetoast and cosmetic, more feel good for the sanctioning than painful for the sanction. This time around, the sanctions were aggressive and multifaceted. So they caused a rapid fall of the Russian currency. It's on average 30%. The fall of the currency could not be controlled because the foreign banking industry froze transactions with the central bank and prevented it from accessing the $630 billion that Russia has in offshore reserves. These are not oligarchs' money. These are central banks' money, which it couldn't use in order to use local monetary policy mechanisms to weaken the inflation. Finally, private businesses began the exodus out of Russia, and some of it is arguably irreversible. So it began with major oil companies, was followed by tech giants, and then other sectors follows. All in all, there are 450 companies that exited Russia. Some of them will not return. So Russian population is thus facing hard to control double-digit inflation and severe job losses. So the only way that, so then the question is, why is it not bankrupt? So the only way that Russia was able to forestall the collapse of its economy has to do with the European dependence on Russian energy resources. That's the loophole in the sanctions, that the elephant in the room, if you will. 40% of European natural gas and 25% of its oil comes from Russia, and it's still going there. And the dollars go the other way. So one could venture a statement that it is that dependence that finances the war at the moment. So in the middle of all this, Germany announces that it was ending its 60-year-old Ostpolitik, that is a policy of accommodation with Russia with trade. Germany canceled the pipeline Nord Stream 2, and Germany, by the way, is the largest user of that 40% and 25%. and it was shifting its entire energy policy away from Russian sources. 2 days later, it announced that Germany was reversing its 75-year-old policy and stance on military spending, and it is now moving to become the third largest military power in the world. So this is remarkable, tectonic, and producing and profound ambivalence. Shifting away from Russian energy reserves will remove much power that Putin holds over Europe. Yes, this is good. Massive increase in military spending by Germany, rather than committing to rebuilding Ukraine, rather than leading Europe in profound shift to green economy, has to give pause to anybody who's heard of dark century and a dark continent that is the 20th century in Europe. And I'll just leave us at that.
Yikes. Okay, Professor Osterveld, question for you. In thinking about genocide, Article 2 specifies that there must be the intent to destroy in whole or in part. And then the Genocide Convention lists a number of modalities and other things. One of the questions that we received says that Putin has done this before in Chechnya by attempting to suppress resistance through terror. And so while the United States, for example, is now commonly using the phrase war crimes, it might also be the case that there are crimes against humanity being committed. At what point does this approach genocide?
You're asking at what point does the attack against Ukraine approach genocide?
Yeah, and in particular, suppression of resistance. I mean, when Lemkin first defined the term genocide, it was much more robust than Article 2 allows. But we know that courts have used a more creative interpretation of Article 2 that doesn't simply, restrict it to killing and so on. So terror, resistance, suppression of resistance, cultural crimes and so on are included in the attacks that Russia is making on Ukrainian people. At what point do we cross the threshold from other atrocity crimes into the territory of genocide?
All right, I'm going to start with the end part of the question first and then come back to the genocide question. So right now, there are countries all over the world referring to what is happening in Ukraine as both crimes against humanity and war crimes. Now, war crimes is a very handy short form for both of these together, because there is the war crime of intentionally directing attacks against civilians and civilian objects. And we see this every single day during the last month in Ukraine. For example, attacks against hospitals, attacks against schools, literally just shelling civilian neighborhoods that have no military objects within them. And because there is a dedicated war crime to this, it is being used as a short form by many countries in order to kind of capture everything that's going on and slotting it into that particular war crime. But it is well recognized, certainly within the legal community, but also amongst politicians, that both war crimes and crimes against humanity are happening. And for those who don't know the difference between the two, war crimes are very specific and serious violations of international humanitarian law, the laws of war. And crimes against humanity are widespread or systematic attacks directed against the civilian population. So both of these are happening at the same moment. They're the same set of facts, can be more than one crime. And Canada, for example, has also referred to war crimes that are occurring in Ukraine. With respect to genocide, the use of the term genocide, I realize, and everyone realizes, that it's a very emotionally packed word. And the challenges, of course, is that President Putin and others in Russia have been misusing this word for quite a long time, since 2014, in order to classify, in order to justify or try to justify what Russia was doing in the Donbass region of Ukraine. So there is there's a political reality that the word has already been extremely misused by the Russian leader, including last week, despite the statements of the Russian delegation to the International Court of Justice in writing that, no, this word has not been used, because of course Ukraine is pointing out that Russia is violating, or is arguing that Russia is violating the Genocide Convention by falsely claiming genocide in Donbass. And that's the basis of the claim before the International Court of Justice. So to come to the end part of the question is, when do we start to use this word? I think that there is some concern about using it in case it is seen as a reaction to disinformation created by Russia. But at the same time, Ukraine has signaled that it's willing to use this word at a particular point in time, because there certainly are some statements by President Putin that seem to be heading potentially in that direction. And I guess I'll leave that there.
Thank you. We can have a conversation about this offline. I have so many questions. Professor Kuritsky, I have a question for you, I think, maybe Professor Ditchok as well. A question has come in. NATO promised not to spread eastward. But how does this affect Russians' decision-making as regards Ukraine and maybe elsewhere? So Professor Kuritsky, to you first, and then to Professor Ditchok.
Well, that's a very interesting question, that question about promises made. So first, maybe I'll talk about a different promise, a promise that was made to Ukraine when the Soviet Union is collapsing and Ukraine claims statehood. Ukraine hosts nuclear weapons. And there is an agreement made in Ukraine that says, please give them up, and you will be protected. So there is this promise made to Ukraine that it will not be left defenseless. So that's one promise that's made. The second promise, and that's the one alluded to in the question, is kind of contended. What was the subject of that promise? It's a conversation that is occurring in the context of East Germany, where it is being promised directly that there will be no troops stationed in Eastern Germany. There is not necessarily a conversation that promises no eastward expansion beyond Germany. And be that as it may, whatever the promise was, in the fog of what was happening in Russia as under Yeltsin and during that time, NATO did expand and expanded to Russian borders directly. So the Baltic republics and Poland, which has a tiny, tiny border with Russia. So this has been always a contentious issue, but Russia is not quite capable of fighting it. But what it was capable of fighting is the further encroachments, or what it perceived as encroachments. And so that's kind of where I would position these two promises as being on the table. And then the question is larger in that it could have been asked in a way, should NATO have disbanded altogether? If Warsaw Pact disbanded, maybe what we should have done is disband NATO at the time and form a new alliance that would not in time be perceived as so threatening to Russia. And that, I think, is a valuable question, and maybe something that should have been considered. Were there actions on the part of NATO that were seen as provocations? Absolutely. Was Russia? So all this to say that this was a complicated situation, and NATO was absolutely not blameless in that conversation. Not Ukraine, NATO. So I think that NATO most certainly bears responsibility for denying the fact that it was making encroachments, and it was making promises to Ukraine, which was very doubtful it was ever meaning to keep, that would actually allow Ukraine into NATO. So I would say that NATO, it's kind of very disorganized answer, was probably not, is partly to blame for what is happening.
I'm going to jump in here and respectfully disagree. I think that this whole discussion about NATO is a red herring that Russia has been using to detract attention from the fact that it is trying to reestablish regional hegemony and reestablish itself as a great power. And although I do not study NATO, I know quite a lot about NATO Russia, NATO Ukraine, NATO issues. And this narrative that NATO has been aggressive is absolutely untrue. And in fact, if you look at the history of NATO after 1989-91, NATO has been bending over backwards not to expand. And Russia was in the 1990s on friendly terms with NATO. And Russia was one of the first countries to build cooperation with NATO. The Partnership for Peace program under Yeltsin's presidency, and then it was expanded into the Russia-NATO Council, which President Putin actually still participated in as late as 2022. And it's a mechanism for consultation, consensus building, joint decision, blah, 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 blah. And if you look at NATO enlargement, how it happens is not because NATO wants to enlarge, it's because the East European countries that had been forcibly incorporated into the Soviet Union, into the Warsaw Pact, once they finally leave, they don't ever want to go back. So they're the ones knocking on NATO's door saying, please let us in, please let us in. And NATO's like, I don't think so. And so what they end up doing is they set up these roadmaps that are so complicated that they figure, oh, they'll never make it. We're just going to set the bar so high that they'll never get in. And you know what happens is they do actually jump higher. And then NATO has no choice but to say, okay, you're in, but only Poland, Hungary, and Czech at first. And then the Baltic states say, we want in too. And they raise the bar even higher. So this narrative that NATO has been expanding to threaten Russia is absolutely false. It's actually the other way around. And specifically with Ukraine, why is there this membership action plan? It's because Ukraine was asking for it. They said, please let us in. And NATO's like, well, we can't really do that, but here's something. Let's just call it a membership action plan. And it's the same thing that Georgia got. Because they're saying, please let us in because we have this neighbor that we're afraid of that's going to invade us again. And NATO has been so slow on this. And if we look at what's happening in the war right now, Ukraine is saying, help us, help us. And NATO's like, we're going to bolster our defenses, but you guys keep going. You're doing great. So, you know, this NATO story is just like, we have to get it right. And sorry, that was a little bit long. And I think we're almost out of time there. And
we are indeed. So
on the genocide question, Putin has very clearly stated Ukrainians don't exist as a people. You're all Russians. And he's bombing them. So I don't know where we need more definition of genocide.
Thank you very, very much. I'm very conscious of time. Our hour is up. It's gone so quickly. Thank you to all of you for attending. Thank you for your great questions. But thanks especially again to Professor Ditchuk. I know you're busy with all kinds of things, and so I'm really grateful to you. To Professor Osterveld again, thank you. And to Professor Koritsky, thank you for joining us again this time. We'll be hosting other events. Stay tuned. Follow us on Twitter and on our website. Thanks, everybody. Have a great afternoon. Bye for now.
Thank you, Joanna, for organizing. Thanks, everybody, for coming.